Okay, welcome back, everyone. So this is the third and final video of part 8 of Intimations of a New Worldview, which is called The Will to Power. So let's do it. So in this video, my thesis is that the pattern that Nietzsche was picking up on with his figure of the Overman. So this is one of Nietzsche's famous concepts, the Overman or the Übermensch or the Superman. This is the same fundamentally as the pattern that Jordan Peterson called the revolutionary hero. With Nietzsche didn't say very much directly about the Overman, but what we can do is extract from Nietzsche's writings his ideal, right? What his ideal human being would be, because I think he is relatively clear about that. And given that the Overman is his ideal, we'll see how Nietzsche's ideal lines up very nicely with the figure that Jordan Peterson called the revolutionary hero. My contention will be that this is because the reason why they're picking up on the same pattern is in large part because both Nietzsche and Jordan Peterson recognized the inherent tension that exists between individuals and the groups that they're embedded in because of the necessity of imitation and conformity, right? Conformity and imitation of the group's culture and traditions are necessary, while at the same time updating those traditions is necessary. And that means that there's this tension between the need to enforce conformity to the tradition and the need to update the tradition when necessary. Because the logic of cultural evolution requires blind adherence, right? Blind imitation to culturally mediated norms and culturally mediated worldviews. Innovation can be dangerous. Innovation, anytime you mess with a complex system, you're bound to mess something up. And so innovation is dangerous, and it has to be regulated and kept in check to a certain degree. And so many within the group are necessarily going to persecute and ostracize anyone who deviates from the deep-seated norms of the group. And so, the person who updates the group in the face of existential anomalies will necessarily come face to face with that persecution, with the wrath of the group. The ultimate form of this process, which is a manifestation of the process of complexification, is embodied in Jordan Peterson's work in The Revolutionary Hero and in Nietzsche's work in the figure of the Overman. And so that's what we're going to look at here. So groups of human beings, because we have culture, because we have cultural evolution, the logic of cultural evolution requires that groups must enforce conformity to social norms. And at the same time, there's this requirement that they need to be updated in the face of anomalies. And the fact is that groups do not perceive anomalies, right? Only individuals perceive. Groups are not conscious, right? Groups do not have the capacity to update themselves. Only individuals have that capacity. Only individuals are truly conscious. And therefore, it is individuals who have to update the group in the face of anomalies. And that creates a tension between the individual who perceives the threat posed by an anomaly and also perceives that current social assumptions are insufficient to deal with that threat. And so there's a tension between that individual and the group who cannot perceive the anomaly, and therefore has an interest in maintaining the integrity of current social assumptions. And this tension plays out, I would suggest, Nietzsche suggested, and Jordan Peterson suggested as well. This tension plays out in all forms of innovation. Small forms of innovation all the way up to large forms of innovation, right? A movie about this that I really like is Moneyball. The main character in that movie was somebody who was innovating in the way that he built baseball teams. He was a general manager, and he ran into the wrath of the status quo. Well, that is what happens when you innovate, right? You're threatening the current order is a real threat to many people, right? It's not even like it's a false threat. Like, it actually threatens the way of life for many people, but it's necessary nonetheless. And the ultimate archetype of this process. So that's what both Nietzsche and Jordan Peterson were getting at. They were getting at the ultimate archetype of this innovator type. The ultimate form of it is represented by the revolutionary hero for Jordan Peterson and by the Overman for Nietzsche. In Zarathustra, just to get an idea, if you're not familiar, of how Nietzsche talked about the Overman, He talked about him in very poetic and sort of fuzzy terms, but in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche said, and I quote, that man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss, a dangerous across, a dangerous on the way, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous shuddering and stopping. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. What can be loved in man is that he is an overture and a going under. I love all those who are as heavy drops, falling one by one out of the dark cloud that hangs over men. They herald the advent of lightning, and as heralds they perish. Behold, I am a herald of the lightning and a heavy drop from the cloud, but this lightning is called Overman. End quote. Zarathustra in that book was a prophet of the Overman. Like, that was kind of his main purpose of the book, was to prophesy the coming of the Overman in Thus Spake Zarathustra. Cybulska, in this 2012 paper, details how Nietzsche came up with this idea of the Overman. She said, and I quote, that for Nietzsche, the idea of the Overman was more like a vision than a theory. It suddenly surfaced in his consciousness during the memorable summer of 1881 in the Swiss Alps, born out of that epiphanic experience that also gave rise to Eternal Return, Zarathustra, and God is Dead. It was a timeless moment of ecstasy at the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious, of past and present, of pain and elation. Nietzsche entered his own inferno in the middle of life, so surrounded by death, haunted by memories of his father's death, and also of his shattered friendship with Wagner, the most significant relationship in his life. End quote. Nietzsche had a peak experience, right? We talked about this already. Nietzsche had what can only be described as a mystical experience, or a peak experience, and during that experience is what gave birth to the ideas of the Overman, Zarathustra, God is Dead. His most iconic ideas came out of this peak experience he had in the Swiss Alps. Nietzsche's descriptions of the Overman are found only in Thus Spake Zarathustra, and they are typically vague. So I'm going to follow the lead of John Richardson. I think that John Richardson is right about this and how we can understand what this figure is. And so this is what John Richardson said about the Overman, one of the things he said about the Overman in his book, Nietzsche's System. And I quote, "A person synthesized in the right way in this specific cultural context," and he's referring to the opportunity created by modern nihilism that I talked about in part one. A person synthesized the right way in this cultural context will be, Nietzsche thinks, sufficiently unlike both master and slave that he will amount to a new basic type, an Overman, or rather, he will be a clearer and higher instance of a type we can then retroactively discern, already present as rare individual exceptions back in that slavish history. Nietzsche fluctuates between a narrower and a broader conception of a personal type that is his ideal, one that he commends to be to the best of us and aspires to achieve himself. In its narrowest form, this ideal is the specific revaluer of values at this crucial historical point that Nietzsche wills to become. Indeed, we'll see that this ideal even acquires a religious aura for him by virtue of its world historical role. He aspires to be a prophet, verging into a deity, the prophet being Zarathustra and the deity being Dionysus. I appropriate the term Overman, at some odds with Nietzsche's own use, as a label for this multifaceted ideal whose structure I progressively analyze, end quote. And that's what I'm doing too here. So I am appropriating the term Overman to describe Nietzsche's ideal in the way that Nietzsche described it. And I don't think that's going against the spirit of the idea in any way. So John Richardson says elsewhere in this book that, and I quote, "Because these overmen become most feasible in a society that has passed through nihilism, this last phase of the slave morality's rule constitutes a great opportunity. Thus, Nietzsche looks most favorably on it. It bears the potential that persons of an unprecedented complexity, yet also with a higher health, might form within it. But he also worries that they might not appear. Such persons are now only more possible, not inevitable. The difficulty of such a synthesis, of achieving that oxymoronic, complex unity out of this overrich mix, could mean that no one can accomplish it. All those who, on purpose or not, do bear this diversity might fall apart into it, remaining unstructured mixes of drives or viewpoints. Indeed, even the aspiration to completeness and unity might be lost. People might learn not even to will them. Nihilism might produce only these ambitionless last humans, so it's also the great danger. Nietzsche sometimes thinks of these possible outcomes as distinct types of societies our nihilistic age could come to. The one that breeds only last humans amounts to a kind of institutionalized nihilism, in which will and valuelessness becomes a common practice. Or instead, we are to hope, another society might emerge on the other side of nihilism, one that Nietzsche associates with the Overman. We'll see that he makes this link in two main ways. In the first place, it is the Overman who founds this new society. And /or B, this society is characterized by its effort to bring about Overmen, by its adopting the Overman ideal. End quote. I think that's correct. So we're going to look at the different ways that the different characteristics that the Overman, the Nietzsche's figure of the Overman, and Jordan Peterson's figure of the revolutionary hero have in common. One of these characteristics is madness, that they both talk about them in terms of madness, or that they're characterized in some way by madness. And this is because any deviation from the current deep assumptions of a culture will necessarily be seen as madness from the perspective of somebody who holds those assumptions. This is why Nietzsche says, and Jordan Peterson said it as well, all innovators must have some aspect of madness, right? It depends on the level, it depends on on how deep the assumption is that you're violating in some sense. But at every level of analysis, there's some aspect of that madness. And so therefore, if the Overman is a revaluer of values, then he must also be characterized in some way by madness. And so I'm going to read something that's pretty lengthy here, but I think it's worth reading. So this is from one of Nietzsche's early books called Daybreak. This was when Nietzsche first began his analysis of morality. But he has a passage in that book called Significance of Madness in the History of Morality. And I think it will give an idea of why it is that madness is required for the revaluation of values, right? Why it's associated with madness. So Nietzsche said, and I quote, that when, in spite of that fearful pressure of morality of custom under which all the communities of mankind have lived, many millennia before the beginnings of our calendar, and also on the whole during the course of it up to the present day, we ourselves dwell in the little world of the exceptions, and so to speak in the evil zone. When, I say, in spite of this, new and deviant ideas, evaluations, drives, again and again broke out, they did so accompanied by a dreadful attendant. Almost everywhere it was madness, which prepared the way for the new idea, which broke the spell of a venerated usage and superstition. Do you understand why it had to be madness which did this? Something in voice and bearing, as uncanny and incalculable as the demonic moods of the weather and the sea, and therefore worthy of a similar awe and observation. I'm going to stop there for a second. So this is not a really radical claim, I think. I mean, it's not as radical as it may seem at first glance. I mean, this is the same thing as what Nietzsche is talking about what Jordan Peterson is talking about as the shamanic initiatory crisis, which is something that we don't see in agricultural societies, right? We don't see in societies without shamanism, but as Nietzsche says, we live in the world of exceptions, right? We live in a time period where this is not the case, but it has been for most of human history. That's Nietzsche's claim. Which, if it's been the case since before agriculture, that would be the vast majority of human history, prehistory, anyways. He goes on. Something that bore so visibly the sign of total unfreedom as the convulsions and froth of the epileptic, that seemed to mark the madman as the mask and speaking trumpet of a divinity, something that awoke in the bearer of a new idea himself reverence for and dread of himself and no longer pangs of conscience, and drove him to become the prophet and martyr of his idea. It is through madness that the greatest good things have come to Greece, Plato said, in concert with all ancient mankind. Let us go a step further. All superior men who were irresistibly drawn to throw off the yoke of any kind of morality and to frame new laws had, if they were not actually mad, no alternative but to make themselves or pretend to be mad. And this indeed applies to innovators in every domain, and not only in the domain of priestly and political dogma. Even the innovator of poetical meter had to establish his credentials by madness. The recipes for becoming a medicine man among the Indians, a saint among the Christians of the Middle Ages, an Angakok among Greenlanders, a Pagi among Brazilians, are essentially the same. Senseless fasting, perpetual sexual abstinence, going into the desert, or ascending a mountain or a pillar, or sitting in an aged willow tree which looks upon a lake, and thinking of nothing at all except what might bring on an ecstasy or mental disorder. Who would venture to take a look into the wilderness of bitterest and most superfluous agonies of soul, in which probably the most fruitful men of all times have languished, to listen to the sighs of these solitary and agitated minds? Give me madness, you heavenly powers, madness that I may at last believe in myself. Give me deliriums and convulsions, sudden lights and darkness. Terrify me with frost and fire such as no mortal has ever felt, with deafening din and prowling figures. Make me howl and whine and crawl like a beast, so that I may only come to believe in myself. I am consumed by doubt. I have killed the law. The law anguishes me as a corpse does a living man. If I am not more than the law, I am the vilest of all men. The new spirit which is in me, whence is it? If it is not from you, prove to me that I am yours. Madness alone can prove it. And only too often this fervor achieved its goal all too well. In that age in which Christianity proved most fruitful in saints and desert solitaries, and thought it was proving itself by this fruitfulness, there were in Jerusalem vast madhouses for abortive saints, for those who had surrendered to it their last grain of salt. End quote. And so this is the claim that Nietzsche is making, that innovation, generally speaking, has some aspect of madness, and that the most innovative, generally speaking, either have to be mad or to make themselves mad, which is a strange claim. But I think there's good reason to believe that, well, it's the same claim that Jordan Peterson made, right? And it's the same claim, as we talked about earlier about this hierarchy of beliefs and values. Well, you can innovate at the bottom of that hierarchy, and you're not going to be, going to the nut house anytime soon. But if you try to innovate about things that are near the top of that hierarchy, the base, right? You're going to generate a whole lot of psychological entropy and uncertainty. And generally speaking, that manifests often as madness. So we've already seen that madness is also characteristic of Jordan Peterson's revolutionary hero. So in Maps of Meaning, his section on the revolutionary hero begins with the discussion of the shamanic initiatory crisis. We already talked about that in part 2, so I'm not going to go over that in detail here, but during the incubation period before the shaman emerges as shaman, Jordan Peterson says that his comportment during the period of incubation preceding his emergence as shaman is generally marked by commission of acts considered characteristic in modern and archaic culture alike of serious mental breakdown. We've already talked about the evidence for that as well. So the Overman and the revolutionary hero are both associated with madness because in both cases they must violate the deep assumptions of the society in which they appear. So the process that characterizes them in some sense, so we've talked about chaos, mental chaos as being associated with madness, right? That's the ultimate form of mental chaos. And mental order would then be sanity. And so the process that characterizes the revolutionary hero and the Overman, right, that process of updating the deep assumptions of the society has to take place at the border between sanity and madness, right? That's essentially what that is. It's the border between order and chaos. And this is why it must be an individual and not a group, because only individuals can break with those deeply held norms of the group, right? The group itself is not an entity that can do that. It is only individuals that can do that. And that's the tension, right? That eternal tension between the individual who perceives anomalies and the group who can only adhere to the norms of the group. So it's just a figure, this is basically what I think is going on in this with these figures, right? That process that Jordan Peterson talked about that characterizes the journey of the revolutionary hero, the personal descent into chaos, the reemergence back into society, and then the societal descent into chaos and reemergence into a higher order. Well, that's the process that occurs at the border between order and chaos. But psychologically, it manifests as the border between sanity and madness, right? Because that's what order and chaos are psychologically. And so that is where this process occurs. It occurs at the border between sanity and madness. So both the Overman and the revolutionary hero are associated with being persecuted by the group because they break with the deeply seated norms of the group. It may be hard for people within the group to tell whether the revolutionary hero or the Overman is good or not. Right? It will be ambiguous to some degree. Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning says that it is those who have sold their soul to the group who will be least capable of telling the difference between the revolutionary hero and the dragon of chaos. For those who have clung too tightly to the social norms of the group, all they will see when they look at the revolutionary hero is chaos and danger. For Nietzsche, it is those who he calls the good and the just who will be most likely to persecute the Overman. So, we've talked about the fact that all conventions, right, all social conventions have to be protected to some degree from innovators. But there are some people who, those who have a great fear of the unknown, a great fear of chaos, who cling too tightly to current assumptions. And these are those who Nietzsche calls the good and the just, and those who Peterson says have sold their soul to the group. I'm going to read something that Jordan Peterson and his colleague Flanders said in this 2002 paper on complexity management about this. They said, and I quote, that it is necessary for us to generate simplified, functional models in order to function in situations that are constantly beyond our understanding. However, this process of simplified functional modeling can be pathologized by individuals who are unwilling to allow any unconstrained complexity whatsoever to exist. Pathologized, that is, by the existential cowards who make ideological purity the hallmark of existence. The adapted human being is protected by a functional shell of belief, but he or she is also able to repair that shell or even to reconstruct it in its entirety when it is challenged by a shift in circumstance or environment. Ideologically committed individuals, by contrast, make personal omniscience in the guise of obeisance to a transpersonal belief system an axiom of individual faith. In consequence, they undermine, then destroy their personal capacity to explore and update, since everything that needs to be known has, in their view, already been discovered. End quote. And so we talked in part 7, when we talked about the psychology of meaning, about complexity being the fundamental problem that we have to deal with, right? Well, one option that you have in dealing with complexity is just to wall off anomalies, at least within a certain, to wall off anomalies from those highest assumptions in your hierarchy of values and beliefs, right? You can just essentially say nothing's getting in there, right? Like there's no anomalies are getting in there. And commitment to those beliefs is like, that's what the highest value is, right? You have to be committed to those beliefs or values. Well, that's a problem, right? Because those beliefs and values are temporary. Because what is of highest value is not the particular outcomes of the process of exploration and update. It is the process of exploration and update itself that is of the highest value. And so at some point in time, those highest values and beliefs, right, even if they're extremely cherished, they have to go too, right? They're always in process. And so they are essentially putting themselves in opposition to the process of exploration and update, which is the process of complexification. These people who Jordan Peterson calls existential cowards, they think of themselves always as being very moral and very good people, doing God's work or doing whatever. They may not believe in God, but whatever. They're the good guys, right? And the people who are trying to say bad things or push ideas that they don't like, those are the bad guys. Everybody who punishes heretics thinks that they're a really good person for doing it. And these are the people who Friedrich Nietzsche calls the good and the just, and those who Jordan Peterson says have sold their soul to the group. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, "Behold the good and the just. Whom do they hate most? The man who breaks their tables of values. The breaker, the lawbreaker. Yet he is the creator. Behold the believers of all faiths. Whom do they hate most? The man who breaks their tables of values. The breaker, the lawbreaker. Yet he is the creator." These are, Nietzsche is referring to these existential cowards who metaphorically dam up the water of life. Right? Jordan Peterson, we'll talk about this in part 10. Jordan Peterson has a nice discussion about, this process is akin to the mythological theme of the water of life. And so these ideologues place themselves in opposition to the process of complexification. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche said, and I quote, "Verily, you who are good and just, there is much about you that is laughable, and especially your fear of all that which has hitherto been called devil. What is great is so alien to your souls that the Overman would be awesome to you in his kindness, and you who are wise and knowing, you would flee from the burning sun of that wisdom in which the Overman joyously bathes his nakedness. You highest men whom my eyes have seen, this is my doubt concerning you, and my secret laughter. I guess that you would call my Overman devil." End quote. And so we see here, again, a confusion, right, by those who have sold their soul to the group, the good and the just. They don't, those who have sold their soul to the group, when they look at the revolutionary hero, they see Satan, essentially. But the same thing is true of the good and the just when they see the Overman. So another thing that the Overman and the revolutionary hero have in common is their unification of opposites, right? So there's talk by both Jordan Peterson and Nietzsche about these figures unifying and synthesizing opposites. In Maps of Meaning, for example, Jordan Peterson said, and I quote, that when faced with a paradox whose solution is impossible in terms of the historical canon, the revolutionary hero takes inspired action and transcends his culturally determined limitations. Instead of denying the existence of the problem and therefore tormenting those who cannot help but posit it, the revolutionary hero accepts the apparently impossible task of solution and of reuniting the warring opposites. He admits the possibility of successful solution, not because the problem can be minimized, but because he believes that human nature can expand to meet it. End quote. And so we're going to see that this is also an important aspect of Nietzsche's concept of the Overman. He is also somebody who unifies opposites. Cebulska, in the 2012 paper, in her 2012 paper, said this about it, and I quote, she said, I think this is a woman, so I'm going to say she. Cebulska, if you're a man, I'm sorry. She said, and I quote, that Jung believed that the archetype of a hero is the oldest and most powerful of all archetypes, and considered religious figures such as Buddha, Christ, or Muhammad to be its various personifications. The hero's journey is ultimately a journey towards self-integration. Okay, we've seen that before, right? That's what meaning is for. It's for integration, right? The hero's journey occurs on the path of meaning because that's the path towards integration and wholeness. She goes on. The final destination, which Jung called individuation, is a state of wholeness and completeness, and it involves the unification of opposites. Indeed, coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of the opposites, a concept borrowed from Heraclitus, is a propelling force in becoming the Overman. The constant tension and energy of the conflict becomes a source of inspiration and creativity. The strife leads to new and more powerful births. The superabundance of any force inevitably produces its opposite, and an inner balance can be achieved by uniting, or overcoming, to use Nietzsche's term, these opposites. The restoration of equilibrium is the essence of healing. The Overman advocates a new great health, which he equates with an all-embracing totality, whereby all opposites are blended into a unity. The conscious and the unconscious, good and evil, the earthly and the spiritual, synchronize in contrapuntal harmony. A noble soul is no longer divided. It becomes an individual, not a dividual, as Nietzsche has stressed. The element of transformation or resurrection lies at the heart of the hero's message. The great hero overcomes himself, sublimates his impulses and passions, and owes nothing to anyone, not even to God. In the process of becoming what one is, the Overman unites reason and passion, order and chaos, discipline and ecstasy, end quote. And so, this is the same thing, right? It's the unification of opposites, and we see in Nietzsche's writing that this is characteristic of the ideal. The ideal is able to unite all of the opposites and become a fully functioning unity. You may also recall that we talked about self-actualization according to Abraham Maslow, and this is something that he saw in his self-actualizers, that they transcended the dichotomies that we have built for people between selfishness and selflessness, for example. So we've already discussed in part 2 the creative illness. So the revolutionary hero goes through a period of illness. So when I quoted that about the creative illness, that was also quoted in Maps of Meaning in the context of Jordan Peterson's discussion of the revolutionary hero. And so the revolutionary hero goes through this period of sickness, right? And this is the next aspect that we're going to talk about, that the revolutionary hero and the Overman have in common. They represent a kind of synthesis of health and sickness, right? So they are not healthy and they're not sick necessarily, but they are a synthesis of the two. As Terence McKenna said, that the shaman is not a madman or a sick man; he's a sick man who has healed himself, and we see this in the Overman as well. So again, I'm going to quote Richardson here. His discussion of this within Nietzsche's system, he said, and I quote, that the Overman must accept as a welcomed part of himself sickness as well as health. Although the Overman's values do favor health, and indeed pick sides in all the other oppositions he bears, he sees in each case the worth of the other. Above all, he sees the value of sickness in health, how the highest activeness isn't purely so, but has taken reactivity up into itself. The Overman acts on this lesson. He finds and even cultivates sickness in himself as a necessary stage in his self-creation. So the genealogy of morals describes the self-experimentation of modern thinkers. Afterwards, we heal ourselves. Being sick is instructive. The Overman loves his own past sickness and wills that it recur, because he sees its role in a higher health that incorporates it. This is his Dionysian health, unlike the master's Apollonian in not being uniform, not a health that wills only health. Nietzsche also calls it the great health, that one does not merely have, but also continually still acquires and must acquire, because one always again gives it up and must give it up. The Overman gives it up by becoming reactive again and again, and then struggling to create a still more comprehensive health beyond that illness. This shows a still stronger sense in which the Overman is, as we saw before, a synthesis of both master and slave, end quote. Right, so the master type is healthy, right, psychologically healthy in all the ways that we would normally think of it. It's just that they're also uncreative and rigid. The slave type is generally characterized by kind of sickness, a psychological sickness. The Overman is the synthesis of these two, because the period of sickness, right? So we see this with the creative illness. The creative illness is a kind of sickness, but it's a necessary sickness that gives birth to a higher kind of health through creativity. So we also see in this discussion of the Overman and the revolutionary hero that they are characterized as being alone, as being fundamentally alone. Jordan Peterson quotes Henry Ellenberger in his discussion of the revolutionary hero, who points out that the benefactor of the creative illness suffers from feelings of utter isolation, even when he has a mentor who guides him through the ordeal. And this is reflective of the fact that those who are truly innovative often suffer from feelings of isolation and of being alone, even if they are not physically alone. Simply being misunderstood is a cause of loneliness in some sense. So in Thus Spake Zarathustra, and Zarathustra, really is a book that is for the Overman, right? Like it's a book that is about the prophecy of the Overman in some sense. Nietzsche has a passage in there called "On the Way of the Creator," in which he discusses the isolation and anguish that is felt when somebody breaks from the herd, as Nietzsche would say. And then this is especially true in the moral domain. And so I'm going to read that passage in full. It's kind of long, but I think it's important to get a grasp on how Nietzsche was talking about this in the context of the Overman, right? Because the book Thus Spake Zarathustra is in some sense for the Overman, and it's to the Overman for Nietzsche. And so this is, even though Nietzsche isn't explicitly talking about the Overman here, he is talking about the Overman. And so we're going to read what he said. These are Nietzsche's words of encouragement, essentially. And I'm not going to read the whole thing in full, but it's a lot of it. So this is called "On the Way of the Creator." Nietzsche says, and I quote, "Is it your wish, my brother, to go into solitude? Is it your wish to seek the way to yourself? Then linger a moment and listen to me. He who seeks easily gets lost. All loneliness is guilt. Thus speaks the herd, and you have long belonged to the herd. The voice of the herd will still be audible in you. And when you will say, I no longer have a common conscience with you, it will be a lament and an agony. Behold, this agony itself was born of the common conscience, and the last glimmer of that conscience still glows on your affliction. Can you give yourself your own evil and your own good, and hang your own will over yourself as a law? Can you be your own judge and avenger of your law? Terrible it is to be alone with the judge and avenger of one's own law. Thus is a star thrown out into the void, into the icy breath of solitude. Today you are still suffering from the many, being one. Today your courage and your hopes are still whole. But the time will come when solitude will be weary, when your pride will double up, and your courage gnash its teeth, and you will cry, I am alone. The time will come when that which seems high to you will no longer be in sight, and that which seems low will be all too near. Even what seems sublime to you will frighten you like a ghost, and you will cry, all is false. There are feelings which want to kill the lonely, and if they do not succeed, well, then they themselves must die. But are you capable of this? To be a murderer? My brother, do you know the word contempt yet, and the agony of your justice? Being just to those who despise you, you force many to relearn about you. They charge it bitterly against you. You came close to them, and yet passed by. That they will never forgive. You pass over and beyond them. But the higher you ascend, the smaller you appear to the eye of envy. But most of all, they hate those who fly. How would you be just to me? You must say, I choose your injustice as my proper lot. Injustice and filth they throw after the lonely one. But my brother, if you would be a star, you must not shine less for them because of that. And beware of the good and the just. They like to crucify those who invent their own virtue for themselves. They hate the lonely one. Beware also of holy simplicity. Everything that is not simple it considers unholy. It also likes to play with fire, the stake. And beware also of the attacks of your love. The lonely one offers his hand too quickly to whomever he encounters. To some people you may not give your hand, only a paw, and I desire that your paw should also have claws. But the worst enemy you can encounter will always be you yourself. You lie in wait for yourself in caves and woods. Lonely one, you are going the way to yourself, and your way leads past yourself and your seven devils. You will be a heretic to yourself, and a witch, and a soothsayer, and a fool, and doubter, and unholy one, and a villain. You must wish to consume yourself in your own flame. How could you wish to become new unless you had first become ashes? Go into your loneliness with your love and with your creation, my brother. Only much later will justice limp after you. With my tears, go into your loneliness, my brother. I love him who wants to create over and beyond himself and thus perishes. End quote. Maslow, Abraham Maslow, who we've talked about multiple times in this series, he also had something to say about the loneliness of creation, and he saw this in his self-actualizing people. He said, and I quote about this, and if I may say it in a very condensed way, it is precisely the godlike in ourselves that we are ambivalent about, fascinated by, and fearful of, motivated to, and defensive against. This is one aspect of the basic human predicament, that we are simultaneously worms and gods. Every one of our great creators, our godlike people, has testified to the element of courage that is needed in the lonely moment of creation, affirming something new, contradictory to the old. This is a kind of daring, a going out in front all alone, a defiance, a challenge. The moment of fright is quite understandable, but must nevertheless be overcome if creation is to be possible. Thus, to discover in oneself a great talent can certainly bring exhilaration, but it also brings a fear of the dangers and responsibilities and duties of being a leader and of being all alone. Responsibility can be seen as a heavy burden and evaded as long as possible. And that, again, I would say it's a kind of fractal, right? In the sense that the deeper the assumptions that you're violating with your creation, the lonelier you are in some, or the more alone you are in terms of your culture, right? If you're violating the deepest assumptions of your culture, that means that you no longer have a common conscience with your culture. And in some sense, that makes you alone. So the final attribute that I want to point out that characterizes both the revolutionary hero and the Overman for Peterson and Nietzsche is that they are both associated with chaos, right? They both associate their ideal with chaos. We've already talked about this in the context of the revolutionary hero. Jordan Peterson had a kind of he had to go through a kind of psychological miniature crisis when he was coming to terms with this idea of the revolutionary hero being associated with the dragon of chaos. I've read this before, but I'm going to read it again. It's not that long, just to provide context here. So Jordan Peterson said about this, when I first began the process that led me to understand these ideas, I painted a frightening picture of the crucified Christ, glaring, judgmental, demonic, with a cobra wrapped around his naked waist like a belt. The image of the exploratory hero manifested itself to me in imagistic representation, contaminated with the figure of the dragon of chaos. And he quotes John 3:14, which says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." This contamination might be regarded as indicative of the danger the development of full understanding of the hero and the world he inhabited posed to my then extant personality structure, which in fact dissolved and regenerated over a lengthy period thereafter. The identity of the revolutionary hero with the serpent of chaos, however, accounts for the hatred and fear his necessary actions produce among the population he is striving to help, because of course he will be perceived as chaos, right, as an anomaly. Nietzsche's ideal is also associated with chaos because it's associated with Dionysus. Dionysus was a Greek god that was associated with chaos. It was especially associated with madness and drunkenness, and the death and rebirth process. And so we see this, in the Overman's love of his past sickness, right? His love of chaos, and so his own chaos. His Dionysian health, right, which is a chaotic health, right, not a stable health like the master type, but a chaotic health that has to lose itself and then regain itself again and again. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche said, and I quote, that he that is richest in the fullness of life, the Dionysian God and man, cannot only afford the sight of the terrible and questionable, but even the terrible deed and any luxury of destruction, decomposition, and negation. In his case, what is evil, absurd, and ugly seems, as it were, permissible, owing to an excess of procreating, fertilizing energies that can still turn any desert into lush farmland. Destruction, decomposition, and negation, right? That's chaos in some important sense. The decadent, right, the moral decadent, destroys out of hatred for being, out of hatred for existence in some sense. But the Overman, or the ideal type, destroys in the service of creation. Right? They destroy. They have to be a destroyer in some sense, because they are, what came before has to pass away in some sense. But their destruction is only in the service of a higher form of order. It's in the service of creation. So, in The Gay Science, Nietzsche says, and I quote, that the desire for destruction, change, and becoming can be an expression of an overflowing energy that is pregnant with the future. My term for this, as is known, Dionysian. But it can also be the hatred of the ill-constituted, disinherited, and underprivileged, who must destroy, because what exists, indeed all existence, all being, outrages and provokes them. End quote. And that's ressentiment, right? So the resentful type, the person characterized by ressentiment, they destroy out of a desire for destruction. But the Overman, or the ideal type, or the revolutionary hero, also destroys. But this destruction is in the service of creation. It's out of a love for life instead of the hatred for life that characterizes the decadent. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche said that creation, That is the great redemption from suffering and life's growing light. But that the Creator may be, suffering is needed and much change. Indeed, there must be much bitter dying in your life, you creators. Thus are you advocates and justifiers of all impermanence. To be the child who is newly born, the Creator must also want to be the mother who gives birth and the pangs of the birth giver. And so all real creation comes with that destructive aspect as well. And similarly, the revolutionary hero in Peterson's scheme is an agent of social change and chaos. So this is just a recap of the overlap between how Nietzsche describes the Overman and how Jordan Peterson describes the revolutionary hero. Both of them are associated with madness, because in the extreme cases of innovation, madness is essentially necessary. They are both persecuted by those who cling too tightly to the assumptions of the group, who Nietzsche calls the good and the just, and who Peterson calls those who have sold their soul to the group. They are both people who unify opposites, right? We see this being an important aspect in both Peterson's writing and Jordan and Nietzsche's. They both cultivate sickness, or they become sick in order to attain a higher health, right? So they are a synthesis of sickness and health, unlike the master type. They are both characterized by their aloneness. They are both identified with chaos. In Peterson's case, he says that the revolutionary hero is contaminated with the dragon of chaos. One important difference, which we're going to come back to in part 10, is that the Overman for Nietzsche is associated with Dionysus. And Nietzsche explicitly puts forward Dionysus as, in some sense, opposed to Christ, opposed to the Christian interpretation of the world. While for Jordan Peterson, the revolutionary hero is explicitly associated with the figure of Christ. And that's really interesting, right? So we see that despite the overlap between these figures, right, Nietzsche's ideal is associated with what he perceives, at least in some of his writing, what he perceives as being fundamentally opposed to the Christian interpretation of the world, while for Jordan Peterson, the revolutionary hero is the ideal that's implicit within the Christian interpretation of the world. And so there is that tension there, and we're going to come back to that in part 10. We're going to talk about that. But to recap, so as we talked about at the beginning, we've talked about this in other places in this series of videos, there is this eternal tension that comes about because of the logic of cultural evolution between the need, right, for groups to enforce conformity of social norms, of group assumptions, of morality, and so on, and the simultaneous need to update the social group when that's necessary, right, in the face of existential anomalies. And so those who break from the norms of the group, one reason they might do so is because they lack discipline, right? That's something that happens all the time. They're unable to adhere to the norms of the group. That's what the decadent does in some sense. But in the ideal case, right, in the case of the Overman or the revolutionary hero or that type of person, they break from the norms of the group because they are truly innovative, in the sense that they are responding to a real anomaly that is facing themselves and the group. And innovation of this kind follows a predictable pattern. It has to, because the innovator will always come into contact with the social norms of the group to some extent. In the most extreme cases, the innovator must either be mad or appear to be mad, simply because anything that violates the deep assumptions of the group is considered by that group to be madness, right? It's like the definition in some sense. He must be persecuted by those who cling too tightly to the current order. He must suffer from isolation, must appear as an agent of chaos, and so on, right? All of that stuff is necessary in the most extreme cases of innovation. And so what Jordan Peterson and Nietzsche have done is essentially take this pattern to its logical conclusion, right, to the archetypal conclusion of it. The archetypal form of innovator appears as the revolutionary hero for Peterson and as the Overman for Nietzsche. The overlap between these characters, as far as I'm concerned, is fairly uncanny. Of course, Jordan was very likely influenced by Nietzsche to a large degree, but I wouldn't say explicitly so, because he doesn't really mention the Overman in Maps of Meaning, although he does quote Nietzsche. He was more influenced by Jung than Nietzsche when it comes to those ideas, as best I can tell. But they differ, right? Because Peterson associates the revolutionary hero with Christ, while Nietzsche associates the Overman with Dionysus, and that's something we're going to talk more about in part 10. And this entails a kind of morality. It's a kind of morality. It's a weird kind of morality, because it's not about any particular principles or rules or anything like that. It's about the process by which those principles and rules are updated. The process represented by the revolutionary hero or the Overman is good in Jordan Peterson's scheme, right? That process, the process of exploration and update, is just what is good within Jordan Peterson's moral scheme. And the denial of that process by those who have sold their soul to the group, or what Nietzsche calls the good and the just, is evil within Peterson's scheme. So it's a process kind of morality. The process is what's good, and the denial of the process is what is evil in that scheme. These latter types have they dam up the water of life, right? That's the mythological way of putting it, right? They block this process of complexification from taking place, and that means that the anomalies, the anomalies don't go away just because you ignore them, right? They just accrue and they get bigger, and in the ultimate case, it leads to the degradation of everything. The denial of this process of complexification leads to the decay and degradation of everything. So that is it for part 8. Part 9 is going to be called the epistemic crisis. We're going to talk about the fact that we cannot talk to each other within Western culture about very important issues. There are some issues that we cannot have a rational conversation about. And there are some issues that are important that aren't being talked about at all. And I think that anyway, we'll get to that in part 9, but there is a crisis of sense making, right? Of separating fact from fiction, but also separating the relevant from the irrelevant. And I think that crisis is very much tied up with everything that we've talked about here in this series of videos. And so we're going to talk about that. And yeah, I hope to see you there. I hope this has been useful to you in some way or another. And I'll see you on the next part. Goodbye.